Whenever you're ready.
I'd like to call the meeting of the Community Finance Committee to order on February 28th at 6:32 p.m. Could you go ahead and do roll?
Mr. Kowski,
Here.
Mr. Davis, Secretary Roseman, Mr. Earl, here, Mr. Henry, Mr. Einhoff,
Here.
Dr. Johnson,
Yes.
Mr. Kohler,
Here.
Mr. Miller,
Here.
Ms. O'Neill, here, Dr. Sanders, here, Ms. Lord, here.
The first item on our agenda is approval of the minutes from our last meeting on January 17th, 2023. Did anyone have any corrections to the minutes or questions for? If not, I have a motion to approve. Motion to approve.
Second.
Thanks, Tom. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Thank you. At this point in the meeting, we have public comments. Is it the sign-up sheet?
We will do, but before we get started, I just want to announce you thing everyone get in. You can stay present, only not the senior resident. The senior, you can stay your present here. That's here,
Okay.
For tonight, public comments.
For tonight, public comments, we have 5 in person and 1 via Zoom. Whenever you're ready.
As with the regular school board meetings, we have a 3-minute limit for public comment, and since I'm the trustee, Black Tom is on Zoom, I'm gonna go ahead and start. So, whoever is first on the list, please have them go.
Our first speaker tonight is Mr. Judith Alexander.
Thank you. My name is Judith Alexander. I'm a longtime park resident. Tonight, I urge you to recommend financing Project 2 only with cash reserves and referendum bonds. Debt certificates and non-referendum bonds are tools intended for emergencies. No emergency exists. Oops, should I start over?
Please.
Okay, so
I'll start your clock.
thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Tonight, I urge you to recommend financing Project 2 only with cash reserves and referendum bonds. Debt certificates and non-referendum bonds are tools intended for emergencies. No emergency exists in funding Project 2. It's recognized best practice to finance major capital projects with referendum bonds, and it's only right that voters be asked to approve being taxed to pay for them. A recent Wall Street Journal editorial advocated putting Project 2 funding to referendum. This reversed its 2015 position supporting D200's effort to bypass voters on funding approval. Oak Park and River Forest voters made clear their desire to vote on spending for big projects in a 2015 petition. In 2020, more than 77% of Oak Park voters agreed that capital expenditures of $5 million or more should be subject to a binding referendum. It has long been the practice of our local taxing bodies to put big capital spending to referendum. For example, in 2017, D97 put a $57.5 million referendum on the ballot to fund school renovations. In 2016, D200 was forced by petition to put a $44.5 million referendum on the ballot, mainly for a 40-meter pool and a smaller garage. In 2000, the Oak Park Library put a $30 million referendum on the ballot for a new main library and Mace Branch repairs. Referendum bonds are utilized by school boards elsewhere in our area. For example, for this April's election, there's a $105 million referendum on Lake Forest High School's renovations. It's worth noting that the bond consultant was Elizabeth Hennessy, who is advising D200 now. Seems that Ms. Hennessy advisors have been instructed. In 2019, a $140 million referendum was on the ballot for renovations of 2 Hinsdale high schools, which included new pools. This was the third time in 3 years that the school board sought voters' approval for a similar project. In 2018, a referendum on $195 million bond issue to fund facility improvements at Main East, South, and West was on the ballot. And in 2014, it's $89 million referendum to fund renovations at the Trier. Please don't give the D200 board an excuse to bypass the voters. Please recommend only referendum bonds plus cash reserves. Because the voters want a chance to authorize spending beyond what's required for operations. Because referendum bonds are financial best practice. Because they're standard practice in our community and elsewhere, and above all, because it's the right thing to do. Thank you for your consideration and for your service.
Thank you, Ms. Alexander. Our next speaker tonight is Mr. Jack Powers.
Hello, everybody. In early 2000s, District 200 board ignored its fiduciary duty to our taxpayers by overtaxing it for a decade, and hence the infamous surplus. Subsequent boards ignored their fiduciary duty by not setting limits on the administration they were supposed to be directing, by ignoring pool studies they paid for, and by failing to insist on multiple physical education / pool options to consider. So here we are. Best practices for deciding project 2 would include insisting on and evaluating multiple options, i.e. gold, silver, and bronze. Transparency, not a marketing effort in funding scenarios that purposely understate the tax implications of non-referendum funding. It would include evaluating opportunity costs, what space and dollars are left for what else. Providing a holistic funding plan for all of the projects so that the board, the administration, and taxpayers can understand what's possible or not, and when and at what cost. And lastly, best practices would include a referendum, much like Lake Forest is doing that with their automatic default position. They consider no other. Several current board members have made comments supporting a referendum, and others were fiscal discipline. Mr. Arkin, in a candidate forum in 2019 at Public Church, said, "Coming to the board when Sarah and I both came to the board, we came in the middle of a project. We were neophytes, and I will readily admit I have in the past that one big mistake I made as a board member was voting to issue non-referendum bonds for that first pool bond project." Sarah Dixon Spivey at the same event said, "My mistake too." In different Q&As, Ms. Spivey has said, "That does not mean that the management plan is a punch list with multiple items, but rather just a complete view of what we can expect the needs of the school to be in the long term so that we can spend wisely." Mr. Kofke at a candidate forum said, "We are not limitless in what our funds are. We need to make sure that there's discipline as the board continuously reviewing what the next phase is and prioritizing what needs to be done. Talking about funding 3 places, fund balance, taxpayer money sitting in our bank. Second is the opportunity our foundation may support it. And 3, we're going to need to go to the taxpayers for a referendum, and that's why I've been so passionate that we need to show financial discipline in our every operations to gain the trust of the taxpayers." Mr. Henry, and I agree with him here, said, "Can't just go to the money tree, somebody has to pay for it. Fiduciary responsibilities that we are making mindful decisions. Don't put a burden on taxpayers." And when asked what does greater financial responsibility look like, Mr. Henry said, "Fiscal responsibility, treat it like your own pocketbook. Responsibility of the taxpayers, know what you can afford." Mr. Henry and Mr. Martiri campaigned, according to his Facebook page, on priorities being ensuring, among other things, ensuring financial accountability, building transparency, increasing stakeholder engagement. This current board has the same fiduciary responsibility to taxpayers that past boards have had.
That's 3 minutes.
Yeah, this is a tougher subject than it needed to be because, like past boards, the current boards place no fiscal constraints on the subject. Since we are faced with a master plan, only a referendum satisfies the board's fiduciary responsibility in the same way the Lake Forest board understood without debate and pressure from the public. Or it should do. If community members and taxpayers, I urge you to protect taxpayer interests. I recommend a referendum. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Powers. Before we go on to our next speaker, I'd like to acknowledge Mr. Davis. Mr. Davis, you can say present.
Present.
Thank you, sir. Our next speaker is Monica Stephen.
Thank you. Good evening. My comment will focus on the funding proposals for the $102 million project 2. Scenarios 1 and 2 follow best practice of placing all borrowing in referendum bonds. It's a democratic process used by school districts in Illinois and every other state. D200 tried to bypass voters on funding a $37.5 million pool in 2015, but a grassroots community effort forced the non-referendum bonds on the ballot. And under duress the following year, the board placed the funding for a $44.5 million pool project on the ballot. 7 years later, we are fighting the same battle with another board trying to avoid a referendum. Voters have the right to vote on the funding of Project 2, which would hike their taxes for the next 20 years. Scenarios 1 and 2 are straightforward and equitable. Current residents will pay the same amount annually as those who live here in later years. That's not true for scenarios 3, 4, and 5. They are front-loaded with borrowing, which would place an unfair and greater tax burden on current residents, many of whom would already be paying more for this project through their tax dollars stockpiled in the cash reserve, taken without authorization by D200 beginning in 2005. Scenarios 3, 4, and 5 are convoluted and include multiple borrowing tools and terms, including non-referendum bonds and debt certificates, which are not best practice in funding major capital projects. While there would be no separate levy for debt certificates, D200 would have to levy 3.5 million more operating tax dollars than necessary each year to repay them. Taxpayers would bear this cost. The $0 cost of debt certificates and bond consultants chart is misleading, and they would cost the taxpayer $199 a year, the owner of a $500,000 home, the property value referenced in the consultant's chart. Each funding scenario includes money from the cash reserve. D200 mountainous surplus has huge best practices at D200. Cash reserves are not supposed to finance major capital projects, but rather to cover funding delays and emergencies. Ethically, all the surplus dollars should have been returned to taxpayers years ago. And Project 1, the new outdoor track and field project, should have gone to referendum for funding approval by voters and to spread out the cost of the investment over the life of the asset, so that future taxpayers who will enjoy the benefit pay for it equally. Today, I emailed you a chart and graph with a high-level analysis of the average annual cost of each funding proposal to taxpayers. Members of the aquatic community who want D200 to push through this project, denying taxpayers their democratic right to vote on its funding, say that scenario 4 would cost taxpayers less, but in fact, scenario 2 would cost less for the first 10 years. I urge this committee to follow best practice and recommend referendum bonds for all borrowing, along with surplus cash reserve dollars for this controversial project. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Sheehan. Our next speaker, Mr. Mark Harmon.
Hello. My name is Mark Harmon. I'm a graduate of class of 91 and a parent of 2 current students, class of 23 and class of 25. I came here tonight to ask you to recommend funding Project 2 as quickly and in low cost a way as possible. Being the parent of 2 active high school students, I've had the unique opportunity to see many of our local Chicagoland suburban high schools and facilities. What's most interesting about those experiences is coming home and hearing what my children have to say. I think the easiest way to sum up their feelings is disappointment. Disappointment with the state of the facilities, the PE facilities in particular of the high school. Having an infrastructure and a facility that kids can be proud of, all kids can be proud of, not be slightly ashamed of as they go around the West Suburban Conference to Lions, to York, to the Downer schools, to the Hinsdale schools, will benefit all students. We had this conversation, as has been pointed out back here, back in 2016. It cost then $40 million. It costs now $100 million. 2 more years, $120 million. 7 more years, $200 million. This is about the students. This isn't about grudges that we hold from past experiences with the board and the school. I urge you for the students to move ahead with funding the project as quickly as possible. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Harmon. Our next speaker, Mr. Kevin Picard.
Hello, my name is Kevin Picard. For a week, the South Oak Park Avenue class of 66. My mother was class of 41. My father was president of the board back in 1966 when the bond issue was passed to build the last really big project here, which connected the gym facilities to the main building. And his name was on the plaque down below by the door. He was no longer on the board at that point, but they honored him anyway when it was constructed. And it's false to say that some of these proposals have little or no cost to taxpayer. Death certificates typically simply kick the can down the road, speeding up when the next operating referendum must happen and increasing its size. Furthermore, use of existing cash is not free money. Your economists can tell you that. There's an opportunity cost of not returning to taxpayers their own investment, their overtaxed money from the past, used to pay down debt, invest in their own for other use. Every time existing cash is used in these scenarios, that could be replaced by bonding the same amount and then using the existing cash to return to taxpayers the same amount. The district still gets the same amount to spend. I know they work that out. It's true. You get the same exact amount to spend, but you return money. Who pays for that? The next generation. For the people who should have been paying for it anyway, under the appropriate matching system of matching costs and benefits. By the way, I have a master's in MBA in finance from the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. And I was studying this stuff since 1988 when I moved back here. Who pays for all this money on the next generation? It's sort of a tax swap deal between generations. This would take a coordinated conditional referendum. The money is required or returned only if the referendum bonds pass. The return mechanism is laid out in the Illinois Fiscal Responsibility Act. You can Google that. The neighborhood schools returned $10 million using this act recently. Why can't this committee evaluate this alternative? Well, Elizabeth Hennessy is not the font of all financial wisdom. This method is superior to the confusing method Jeff Weisglass and I found after Todd Altenberg, the previous business officer here, told us that it was impossible to do that without permanently writing the text. He was wrong. So sometimes the citizens know more than the administration does here. Earn your pay. Oops. Actually, you pay nothing, but you can act like you do. Consider that those other alternatives, and consider that all these things have hidden costs, and don't ignore the opportunity cost of not doing my recommended approach, which has never been evaluated or discussed. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Cooper. Our last speaker, we assume, is Mr. Marty Bernstein. Mr. Bernstein, you want to tell me?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, sir, whenever you're ready.
All right, thank you. Hang on 1 second. I was looking at the scenarios presented for tonight's discussion, and it shows on scenarios 3, 4, and 5 that there's no tax impacts from the debt service bonds. And it says further down the rows on there that that money will be paid back from the operating funds. In another document provided by Raymond James, it says that that money will be paid back by taxes on the bonds. So I'm really concerned about the district doing business with a company that doesn't know what it's talking about. Either there's no tax burden or there is a tax burden. Just because of that, among other reasons, scenarios 3, 4, and 5 should be discarded completely. I think the only legitimate choice would be scenario 2 because it's straightforward. You're going to use some of the money you have and you're going to ask the taxpayers for the rest of it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bernstein, and that concludes tonight's public comments.
Thank you everyone for keeping it to the 3-minute limit. At the last meeting, we had a couple of new administrators join the committee, and we have a new community member also joining us this meeting, so I thought it might be helpful to very briefly go around and do quick introductions for the benefit of Kathleen and Roxanne and Lori, if we could do that. And then we'll continue on with the agenda. So Cal, do you mind going first?
Sure, Cal Davis, River Forest. I have a senior here at OPRF.
Hi, I'm Petra. I have a senior at OPRF, and then I have a 6th grader who's up and coming.
Lori Hewens, an assistant superintendent.
Greg Johnson, I also was senior here at OPRF.
And you're the superintendent.
That's true.
I'm Steve Miller, the committee chair. I have an 8th grader, so I will have a freshman here in the fall and a 5th grader and here in Oak Park.
Greg Kohler, no kids in any school. Very many more secretary for D200, and I'm a former graduate of class 20 and 2 young kids in 10-7.
I'm Kathleen Odell. I live in Oak Park. I have a sophomore here at OPRF and a 7th grader at St. Giles.
Anna Sanders, assistant superintendent for human resources.
Cindy Fedor, CFO.
Lisa Adams, executive assistant superintendent and company board.
Okay, thank you, everyone. Oh, and sorry, Tom.
And Brian.
Yeah, Brian.
Tom Kofsky. I'm president of the school board and have 5 graduates. The last one was in 2017.
And Brian Imhoff, I'm the director of finance.
Thanks, guys. Time flies when you're having fun, and it's been a year since the committee convened, and so it is time to elect officers. So we'll start with nominations for the position of committee chair. It's a 1-year term, so mine has come to an end. And at this point, I would like to call for any nominations for the chair of the committee. Don't everyone show.
So, hey, you can do it again. Negatives.
You've been doing a great job.
Are there any other nominations for committee chair? Seeing none, I will close the nominations and with Steve Miller being the only candidate nominated for the office of committee chair, I will declare myself elected by acclamation and direct Lisa to record so in the minutes.
Congratulations.
Similarly, nominations are in order for the committee co-chair, who has been Greg Kohler for the last year, so it's one of like nominations for the co-chair position. Seeing no others, I will nominate Greg to stick around for another year if it's interesting.
No.
Any other nominations besides Greg?
No. Okay.
Seeing none, then I will declare Greg Kohler as the committee co-chair for the next year.
Bring it to the minutes.
Lisa will
Congratulations, sir.
record that in the minutes.
Yeah.
Thank you. All right, that's the fun stuff.
Mhm.
Okay, the next item on the agenda is the district audit. I asked everyone to kind of take a look at those documents in advance and reach out if you had any questions. Is there any further discussion there? Hoping to preserve as much of our time for the project to conversation as possible, but does anyone have any questions about the audit? No. I did a kind of quick comparison of the budget to actual. It looked like things came in really close to what was expected for the most part. Capital spending being the one item that was a little off more than others. Were there any comments from the auditors? The management letter or anything?
No. No, we had a nice clean audit, another one.
Anyone have questions or comments on the audit?
Steve, I will just say that it's the cleanest audit I've seen in the 10 years I've been looking at it. So
Great. Kudos to Cindy and Brian.
Definitely Brian.
Then at that point, I wanted dive into the project two financing conversation, and the approach that I thought would work well for us is somewhat similar to what Tom did at our last meeting in sharing the board's thoughts on kind of all the key components. So I've kind of laid out sort of a bit of an agenda for that. And we can kind of walk through it. If we zig and zag and go in different directions, that's great. I really want this to be very participatory and conversational, let everyone have a chance to stay on, have their say on all the different pieces. Understand we've got some new folks. Please don't hesitate to ask questions as you're trying to get up to speed, and want to offer up the opportunity to Lori, Roxanne, and Kathleen, if you want to get together for a sidebar, sometime in the future before the next meeting to try to get you caught up. I'm happy to have conversations with you too. Because we're throwing you into the deep end at this point with these topics, but where I thought we would start is the fund balance policy. I think that's the easiest one because we've had a lot of conversations about it and came to a pretty close to, I think, a recommended change when we talked about it in January. Policy 420 currently has a range of 25 to 75%. I think been in consensus that that's too wide a range. The top end is more fund balance than the district needs. Even with taxes being 3 or 4 months late last fall, the district didn't go below 50%. So I think we just need to lock in what we want that range to be, and that's going to determine how much fund balance is available as one of the components to fund project two. So I think we threw out maybe bringing up the bottom a little bit, bringing the top down more, and ending up with a 20 or 25% range there in the 30 to 55, 60% range. But does anyone want to throw out some numbers to kind of start that conversation? Otherwise, I guess I can.
Weren't we talking last time about like 40%?
Mr. Davis, you might say, thank you.
Weren't we talking like 40% before, somewhere in there?
Yeah, it's kind of the middle of the range.
Middle of the range. Or maybe a little bit lower than the middle, 30 to 40%.
Yeah. I like a range of 25%. I feel like if it gets any narrower than that, you end up kind of overcorrecting and having a hard time staying within it. So if you had a 25% range of say 30 to 55 or 35 to 60, that would put 45 kind of somewhere in the middle.
We could do 25 to 52.
We could. We don't have to bring the bottom up either. 25% gets you the top score in the state's financial profile ranking. I generally have an opinion that's a little low for Cook County just because of the uncertainty in fall taxes that we've had in the past and had last year. And so much of the district revenue comes from that. But 25 to 50, I'm open to more discussion on that too. Anyone else have thoughts? Doing some math, good math. Okay.
Was the issue we had this year with the taxes, was that an anomaly or does that happen often?
Well, it happened constantly for a decade or more, but then 10 years or so ago, all of a sudden they were on time every year until this past year. This past year, it seems to be a one-time thing, a lot of finger pointing with changing of systems at the assessor's office that sort of rippled through the whole process. So I think that's why I'm comfortable saying we can bring that balance down, but we're not going to see that again.
So I used to like the 25 to 50, but given the spending potential for the next 5, 10, 15 years, I don't know if I want to go down as low as 25.
Okay. Well, I'm sorry about that. I do feel like, I don't have the policy in front of me, so I don't recall exactly how it reads, but I think it speaks to a percentage of operating spending, so that the capital piece would not be included in that. That makes the calculations a little easier. Is that right, Cindy?
Yep.
Yes. But agreed, that's one of my concerns then is if we're setting a range and then we're saying, okay, now we can spend a big chunk of that to get us down into the range. Is our target to get to the top of the range, the middle of the range, or the bottom of the range? once we've set that range, because I certainly wouldn't want to commit towards capital spending something that brought us to 25% if that was the low end of our range. I'd be looking to break down to somewhere in the top third of the range, maybe. I do feel like in my past life, when I was consulting with districts all over the suburbs, that 25 to 50% range is a very common target for a lot of districts.
In the middle of the road is like 37 to 40. So it's kind of where we want to be. And we're 50 and we start approaching 40, then it's kind of timed up.
And the policy is real specific about kind of what are some of the steps the district would take when the projections are showing, you know, they're projected to go under the bottom end of the range and anticipating making changes and adjustments before you get to that point. Greg, how do you feel about a 25 to 50% range if the recommendation on a fund balance spend down is only taking us to somewhere in the middle or the upper third of that range?
I'd be fine with that then. Cause that kind of gives like a fun target and like, yeah, you can spend it down only to this, but not to 25.
Yeah. Right, because again, the policy, let me make sure I didn't write that down. You know, the policy reads that in the 5-year projections, if we're seeing going below that range, we're gonna make adjustments. So a capital spend next year that takes us below that wouldn't fit within the policy. Are we comfortable with a 25 to 50% recommendation? Great. One of the things I wanted to point out, as I was kind of reviewing the scenarios from the last meeting, one of the things to keep in mind in the fund balance numbers that Elizabeth had in her scenarios and with the different fund balance targets is that was based off of the fund balance in 2027, you know, the last year of the projections, and that's based on a big spend down to wrap up project 1, the fields and the track and the geothermal, and getting to a lower balance in 2024, and then surpluses that kind of get us back up to a higher balance in 2027. So that's based on roughly $19 million of surplus spending in the last 3 years of the projections. So something else we need to consider as we're looking to recommend a certain amount of fund balance towards the project is when that would be available. So it's going to be less available in the next couple of years because there's a lot of other capital not related to project 2 to bring the balances down, and it would really be fund balances more available in the out 3 years of the projections. So again, in looking at the mix of potential fundings on the front end of the project, we might not have as much of the fund balance available as we would further into a project.
Steve, can I ask a question on that?
Yeah.
When we were looking at the year 27, that does include the fields and everything, though, correct? What you're looking at, correct? Because we already have that in the projections.
Right. What I'm saying though is that the fund balances kind of hit a low point next year after doing those projects. This is from the October projection, or the projections. It was like 65 million, which is rough math. Well, actually, the math is out here, 60%, and then we build back up to 85% fund balance 3 years later with some surpluses, and so you wouldn't be able to spend a lot of the fund balance towards the project right off the bat, or you might run into some problems with fund balance policy. It would have to be done incrementally and spread out over the life of the project.
Yeah.
Any other discussion related to fund balance? The next piece that I wanted to is another revisit of past conversations. I wanted to get some firm thoughts on some of the recommended changes we had to the debt policy. So this was something we discussed at our October meeting. I want to talk about these concepts a little more generically first, as opposed to specifically related to funding project 2. So the first one is DSEB bonds or debt service extension based bonds, that non-referendum borrowing option that we have due to the tax cap law. You can do 20-year borrowings with DSEB. The different scenarios that Elizabeth ran were all 10-year paybacks, but you could go as far out as 20 years. The recommendation that we talked about in the debt policy was to provide future boards with more flexibility to borrow in the future and limit that to 10 years at the most instead of the 20 allowed by law, but then also limiting how much you could use in years 6 through 10. So we said you could fully utilize the debt service extension base for the first 5 years, and then you could only use half of it in the second 5 years. So that was what was modeled in scenario 5 that brought just under $21 million of principal. But wanted to see if there's some agreement that made sense as a concept to try to preserve future debt service extension based borrowing options for the district and for future boards going forward. The scenarios 3 and 4 then don't really work. They had less DSEB, but it was spread out over the 10 years, and so they wouldn't work within that policy recommendation that we had. So any further thoughts on that restriction to DSEB borrowing? That's really pretty typical of how both D97 and D90 use their DSEB. They use short 3 to 5 year borrowings using debt service extension based to fund their more routine maintenance and upkeep type of capital, but again, not maxing that out over an extended period of time and kind of handcuffing future boards.
And this is just for project 2.
Well, no, I rather just talk about it in general. Do we feel like the district, with that service extension based bonds, there's that petition period like the public comment talked about with the attempted pool borrowing 5 or 6 years ago. It can always go, have the community come in and say, we want to put this to referendum. So this would be saying to the board, regardless of what the community is going to do, we don't think you should try to do this for 15 or 20 years. So do short DSEB borrowings, and the community always has the chance to petition and go through that process as well, regardless of the structure or the limitations we would suggest for DSEB borrowing. I just believe that it provides future flexibility for future boards if we don't permit them to max out that borrowing to its great extent. It's great as an extent of the law.
Steve, did you guys take a look at any of our comparative schools and see what they're doing besides besides 90 and 97?
Not specifically, like my experience in general, and Elizabeth maybe could chime in too, but lots of districts do the borrowing. It's a very common method for funding capital spending, but I wouldn't know what the typical length of a DSEB bond is offhand. I'm just more familiar with what the other districts in the community do. My district where I work at, it has no debt currently, but when we used to do DSEB, we would always try to keep it as short as possible and do 4 or 5 years at the most.
So can you just repeat? So you said the law allows up to 20 years and you're suggesting a maximum of 10.
Right, and the way that service extension based limits work is it's an annual amount of borrowing that we could pay back in a given year. So it's sort of, rather than being a limit on how much you borrow, it's how much you could tax and therefore retire in a given year. And so by structuring it this way with a kind of a step down of, we could do 100% of it for the first 5 years and only 50% for the next 5, then it really allows you to have flexibility to do another borrowing in 5 years if you needed to, even if you maxed out the first 5 years.
I have a question. So
two districts, the neighboring districts to referring to, is that reflected in their policy, the practice, or is it just the practice? And if it's just the practice, why do you feel you're ready to change the policy that already allows us flexibility?
I'll let Cal talk to the District 90 policy if he knows it off the top of his head, but I don't believe it's a policy of District 97. I think that's just typical practice.
I think it's just another rule. I don't think we've ever formalized it, but yeah, they've never, I've been a part of two issues with D7. And it was 1 year, one time was 4 years and one time was 5 years. That's just, yeah, 300, like you don't do it more than 5 years.
I do know of some districts that do codify that in policy that restrict themselves to lesser terms of borrowing than the statute allows. Barrington District 220 is one that I used to work with that had a policy that restricted it more.
And we do so.
But again, is that just sort of an unwritten rule, or is that?
It's just, like, unwritten rule that is short term, but they just agree on it. In the last 2 or 3 times it been 7 over a 7-year period, so 17, so we're up again next year before that was 10.
My belief is it's a good practice, whether or not it needs to be codified in the policy.
Oh, yeah,
It's obviously worked for the 2 feeder districts without it.
It's definitely a short term issue, yeah, it's definitely short term. I don't know of anyone doing 15 or 20 year.
Hey, Tim. Can I request, because I like to have more data to pull from, me personally, and you mentioned there's 2 districts and everyone else, you said 7 years. I just want to kind of have more of an idea of what's actually done as an industry practice, not just who's next to us, but perhaps I think more research needs to be done on that before we start creating policy. We don't want it to be what we think it should be, because we really should have this more structured in a more data-driven way. So if it take more time, but I really don't think, my opinion, as a board member, I like to see, Superintendent do this, obviously the same thing. Data should drive what we do, and not really what we think.
Absolutely. Cindy, can you give me the list, your current list of peer districts that you use for comparative stuff, and you can work on pulling that together?
Yeah, I think I just want to throw one piece out there too, based off of your last comment, that little last exchange too. Policy is useful for the comparative districts, but what we're really getting at here is like what is common practice. So that's a little bit of a different, bit of work, right? You call the districts trying to figure out what it is.
I think I could get that the practice side of it, just for financial statements and stuff that's easily available.
Good, I just want to make sure we're looking at that stuff.
And the policy stuff should all be online too. It's just looking at 2 different places really.
Okay, good.
Thank you. So absent having more comparative data, do we have a general feeling that shorter is better when it comes to non-referendum borrowing, or even others would you rather we wait even on
I think we're gonna do, we should do it correctly. Okay. Not saying it's incorrectly, but I feel we should, we're gonna put it in codifying the policy, it really should be thought out and driven by data and research.
any other questions or comments on these so then the other non-referendum.
So I would just ask that, so I agree with Kabrib's ask. And as I'm hearing this, really what we're talking about then is, and I know it moves as through the years, but I was just doing a little math. If we do 100% of 5 years and then 50% of the next years, that means that we are kind of saying that that's a total of 3/8 of the total current DSEB capacity, if I'm, approximate. So it would be nice to kind of translate that into some, percentage of overall DSEB capacity and what those dollars are. Do you follow me?
For the comparative data?
No, when, yeah, right, when we get to it.
For our policy,
When we get to it and we say, you know, I'm just trying to write down here, when, if the guidance is, you know, as was said, if after looking at comparatives, just using the example stated of 100, up to 100% in the first 5 years, and then 50% of the next 5 years, and 0% of the next 10 years, that in my mind means 37.5%. I know I'm being linear of the total amount. Am I looking at this incorrectly?
No, that sounds like it's
Okay.
right.
And 35.7 of a number is kind of, it translates it into then what the capacity is there. So
And I have a clarifying question based off of Tom's question in there. Because I think your intent is, I'm almost quoting you, I hope, is that in the subsequent years, 10 to 20, while it would be zero at this moment, the purpose of keeping that at zero is to preserve potential future borrowing capacity once we get to those years. Is that correct?
Right, and it wouldn't even be till you're 10, you know, when you're 5,
That's
or
right.
even prior to that, depending on your debt structure, you can start accessing the 50% of, you know, years 5 through.
Yeah, so it might be 37.5% from
Right.
the start point.
Right,
Yeah,
yeah.
is that what it would be?
Every year that's gonna get paid off, there's a new year 20 that has no debt in it, and the calculation changes.
Right, okay.
Okay, then I wanted to move on to the debt certificate piece. This one might be a little harder to do some pure research on, but maybe not. I'm not sure if all of the ISB documents are gonna clearly delineate what's a bond versus a debt certificate, but I'll try to do a little digging on that too. But we also talked about trying to limit the use of debt certificates. Again, it could be a 20-year borrowing. But because these are funds paid back from the operating funds, we thought that you shouldn't commit future boards to potentially multi-million-dollar expenditures out of the operating funds for debt for such an extended period of time, and recommended limiting it to 5 years. But again, that's something that we want to do some more research before we completely weigh in on it. I'm fine with that too.
Steve, I did have a question on that too. If I looked at that, if I just look at what we were using of the 3.5, so I mean, we would have 17.5 over the 5 years. Is that saying that the amount that we would be able to receive in cash and use, or are you saying that it would also include our principal and our interest payment? So we may be only, getting 14 million to stop.
Well, there's no limit on the dollar amount, it's just on the repayment. So, you know, Elizabeth used the 3.5 per year just based on what the current projections look like.
Right.
But I think that's an important thing that we should also consider is do we want to limit it to a total dollar amount of borrowing, or a total, or like a maximum annual amount as well? I think you could though really, I guess I don't generally like that certificates. I think it's sort of a last resort type of item, and would only be comfortable doing it if the projections of the budgets showed that we can afford it. And so maybe that's all of the requirement we would need in the policy. Keep it short, projections need to show that you can afford the payback. But again, I guess I'd like everybody else's thoughts on that method of borrowing. Anyone?
Looks like Kel's thinking.
Oh, debt certificates?
Yeah.
Oh. Yeah, I don't particularly favor debt certificates. They would be a last resort for me, for the most part. If we really needed to do it. Yeah, I just. Because it's kind of the same if you do them short term though with these debt bonds, but once you start getting long term on them, you're paying a lot.
Right. Then if you've got the surpluses in the budget, just pay as you go.
Right.
Why borrow short and pay interest?
Exactly. It's like a bank credit card.
Anyone else on debt certificates?
Nothing different to add. I mean, it's very similar.
One thing on the debt side that we didn't really discuss in detail yet is debt structure. The policy that we looked at in October mentioned it, they preferred level debt service. The pros for level debt service is it's the same every year for the budget, which makes it easy. It's the same every year for the community and the taxpayers as well. But the policy also did say the more rapid repayment, to quote the policy, is where it would be permissible to meet debt repayment goals. And so that's sort of the concept with the DSEP proposal I had was if we pay off more DSEP earlier, then you've got more flexibility sooner. So that's something I think we need to start thinking about is these multiple combinations of ways to fund these projects. Not only how much is going to come from each bucket, but then how do we structure that from a taxpayer's perspective and from a district's perspective. We can't look at projects in a vacuum. There's 3, 4, and 5 to come. Lots of parts of the building that won't have been addressed yet when we finish project 2, and so we want to make sure future boards have as much flexibility as possible to fund those in a way that's most cost effective and least impactful on the taxpayer. Typically with the shorter borrowings, the DSEP bonds, it's level because you have a cap in the DSEP, but with referendum bonds, you could structure it flat. You could have it going up each year as assessed values are going up and as well, and structuring it in different ways. So just want to see if anybody had any concerns or preferences on comes to structure or any recommendations that I want to make to the board.
Because it's hard to really answer that until like I know a dollar amount. I feel like that's more of like partially a question of like when the board gives us a dollar amount, like they want to put $2 million of bonds. I think that's something when they come back to us, kind of look at a structure of options of, because like I don't want to like, right now, like I don't want to like front load everything and have massive payments and then slowly gradually down. I'd rather like step up right now, just in general. To get to a certain level, I just don't know what that level is. Per se.
Right, and I don't think we're going to come with a real detailed specific recommendation, but if we have some parameters, it reduces the number of scenarios that ultimately will need to get run. But yeah, we're not going to, there isn't an answer to this, but I'm wondering if anybody had any thoughts, and I agree that ultimately some options need to come to us and then the calculations made and then we'll understand how we're balancing the impact on the taxpayers and the interest cost and respect.
I have a comment. I just guess in general, I don't understand why we're saying that this will provide like limiting the option or decreasing the time of repayment would provide for more flexibility. The law already gives us higher flexibility. So I just don't understand why we're saying that it increases flexibility. In my opinion, it decreases. Of course, we would want to follow the best practice, but why limit yourself?
Well, you're right. We're giving current boards less flexibility so that future boards have more flexibility. So if the current board decided to issue a 20-year DSEP that used up all the DSEP for the next 20 years, then future boards would not be able to use that as a borrowing option at all. And so that's why if we limit the current board on how they can borrow using DSEP, then a future board in 5 years could use DSEP again instead of having to wait a longer period of time. Does that make sense?
I have a question too, maybe I misunderstood something. But I thought from our discussion tonight, what was supposed to happen is there was supposed to be some options going forward, like, it would be this, and this. That's what I was understanding. That's what we would be doing, is there would be options. It wouldn't be going back to the board and saying, here's an outline of questions that have been answered. So I guess.
We're working towards that. So what I was hoping to get were some guardrails on each of these key pieces that we could then overlay on the 5 scenarios that we have. And maybe based on some decisions we made on some of the pieces that eliminates a scenario or two, or we need a version B of one of the scenarios or something like that. So I don't think we're gonna be able to come up with a scenario from scratch on our own in the limited time that we're meeting, but I would like to have some parameters on each of the different components so that we can decide, okay, we've got a couple options here that fit the parameters and the recommendations that the committee has, or we need to modify them in certain ways. And then that would be what we present to the board.
So that would be then a March meeting then is when that would be coming, or when would that come to the board on?
Let's see how the conversation goes tonight.
Okay.
So I have a quick question. So we have 5 scenarios. Is that all we have? Can that be a combination? Can that be more investigation to it? I guess what I'm looking at it is we have 5 scenarios we received from Raymond James, right? I don't think we can have to stop and just say, okay, you can look at it from more holistic way and what are the true options. So we know right now price tag is 102, right? Estimated. You know, we've asked for fund balance. We know what the delta is going to be. So maybe look at that instead of just these are only things we look at, but look at the lens of what can and should we do for the taxpayers. And I mean, that's how I'm just kind of, I don't want to guide you in any kind of way, but I do want to guide you to look at it in a more disciplined way, not just it's all we have. So the options I don't.
I think you're saying the same thing. I was in a different way. So yeah, that's what I'm wanting us to work towards is eliminating any options that don't fit the parameters that we think the district should be using, and then with whatever's left, is there something in between, or what are the ranges, or something that's completely different? Yeah,
I want to the way.
absolutely.
Right. So that would be my preference as a board member.
That's my preference.
Because as was so well stated in my statement, I remember it is about fee discipline, and it's not just making an option. So it has to be done. It's how we do it, right? So I would feel more comfortable if we make sure we exhausted every potential option what we're looking at before we commit or before you guys recommend something to the board.
Agree. So I think the debt structure piece is something we can kind of table, so we get a little further down the line and are looking at more fine-tuned options. Here, in general, the scenarios that we got are all level debt service other than scenario 5 is the D200 step down that we talked about in our potential debt policy.
And technically, I don't think we need all the money at once. I mean, how long is this project going to take? A few years. We have what we have right now, and either we borrow the money that pays the front end and we pay the back end out of the cash and everything gets kind of covered, but we don't need to go to the village and the board and everything and say we need $116 million and this is how we're going to do it. Because if the project takes 4 years, we're not going to pay somebody $116 million and then they're just going to be here for 4 years. We're going to pay it in pieces. So we may want to look as an option of cutting up the financing.
Right, and that was something Elizabeth, I think, addressed at the last meeting, where once D200 has been authorized, you have, I think, 3 years to issue those bonds. For the referendum, you have 5 years to issue after the successful referendum. So there'll definitely be flexibility on timing and piecing it together with different components, and that's where the fact that we're spending down fund balance now and that it's coming back up in the last 3 years of the 5-year plan comes into play too. The last piece I had on debt policy then was something that we talked about at the last meeting also is that overall debt limit, 6.9% of the assessed value for the district, and something that I think if we look at any scenario that includes issuing bonds, we need to be again in trying to preserve flexibility for future boards and recognizing there's future project needs. How much of that we're utilizing, and the more that we use out of existing balance, the less bonds we issue, and the more of the debt limit we have available. Also, the more that we pay off sooner, the more that debt limit becomes available in the future as well. Using rough numbers with the most recent EAV, that's about 170 million. I think there's more than 170 million dollars worth of work the building needs, and so wanting to anticipate that we've got slightly over $100 million project here, and potentially lots more to come. And so whenever we look at scenarios, needing to recognize that that's another piece that needs to weigh into all the considerations. Ultimately, the shorter the borrowings that the district does, it's going to have a higher property tax impact, but it's going to free up that capacity sooner. Shorter borrowings also can have less interest costs as well. So there's pros and cons to both sides of that. Ultimately, in trying to preserve future debt capacity, we've got the best way to do is to control the cost and need and spend less on the project, but then obviously borrowing less and paying it up more quickly is going to impact as well. Anybody else have any thoughts on the debt limit?
I really think that's also something that we need to, consider, like how do we control the costs on these projects to make sure that they don't, exceed the original, budget? Because we can't just say, okay, this project is approved, it's this amount, and we already know it's going to be, it's going to come in ahead.
Yeah.
We can use some best practices there. There are entities that are running, great projects and that are sticking to the timeline and are sticking to the budget. We can do that too.
Agreed. Something Cal and I talked about when we spoke last week was along those same lines, and I was going to mention it when we get to the future agenda items, but I think there's a lot of value for this committee and the facilities committee interacting. So in some way, whether it's subcommittees that both kind of get together or I don't know what that might look like, but I want to talk about that further because I do think that's a very important piece for us once things do move forward, if they move forward, that we're still involved in the project as it's in progress and monitoring the costs and understanding the impact of any changes along the way, for sure. And one of the thought I just had on that debt limit piece, that's something else that I know I can get comparative data for, and we can kind of see for our peer districts what percentage of their debt limit do they have available. That's another, along with fund balance percentage, that's something else that's part of it is the financial profile score, so that the state's monitoring that. When you use up more of your capacity, you get a lower score in that area, and so that's something for us to monitor and to have some comparative data for as well.
Yeah, I just remember this happened a few years ago in the news and looked it up. Hinsdale Central did 140 million in 19. It's paid back over 21 years. So just when you guys are researching comparatives or whatever.
I would imagine that that's typical for a referendum funded project. You can take it out 20 years, unless you're in a high growth community that knows you're gonna have lots more people and lots more taxpayers, where you would backload it in a stable community like what Parker Hinsdale, you're gonna have a little debt service and spread it out as much as you can.
And I guess another thought of that, Cal, is comparison can't just be to what they spent, well, that might be what they spent in the next 22 years. Whereas so far, we have an infrastructure that was neglected for decades of our dispatches right now. So what we're looking at, we have to look at it more holistically of we have all this to do. And we're behind by decades. So we've done stuff every 20 years, we've been fine. We just didn't do that. So with Hinsdale, that 121, 40, that's probably what they're, I don't know, maybe they're done, but we have a lot to do. So I think look at the numbers as well, not just here with the Hinsdale, because they're probably additional partners. Right. No, I know, I'm not, I'm just appreciating it. Just looking at, we're looking at, well, as you guys are looking at it, use that same kind of lens of there's way more to do and we can't really model what someone else did that are comparable to us as far as infrastructure wise.
A question for the board members or for the administration. Do we have any rough estimates of what projects 3, 4, and 5 might cost? Like, because I think it's helpful. It would be helpful for us to understand how far out it is, how expensive it might be, even within a margin of error of tens of millions of dollars, like, I don't know, I don't know, I don't know if we're talking about 50 million or 300 million. Because I'm not as familiar with the scope of what's left after this, but.
We don't have a figure that we can share at this point. Your estimates that were originally done with the Imagine team, back in 17 are ones that
That's all we got.
they're archaic,
Yeah.
right, at this point, right? So something new for 3, 4, 5 has not been done, with the basic understanding though that project 5, the last project is substantive. It's Connecticut Field House work, right? So the projects 3, 4, and 5 are smaller. 3, 4, and 5. 3 and 4 are smaller than 5, excuse me. But yeah, no independent work sense that has been done. I'm trying to figure that cost out.
All right. Any other questions, comments, or concerns as it relates to any of the debt topics that we covered so far?
I think we need to be mindful of where we are on one, where we are on the field. Because we don't want to get ourselves in a hole. I mean, if we're financing for project 2, and that's fine. And let's cover 1 and 2, 1 in the track and field, get that done. So that we're moving forward. And I said at the last meeting, we definitely don't want to have 3 projects going at one time.
Sure.
So everyone said that 1 will be done this summer and the field will be done this summer. And then scope and estimates and testing will be started on 2 next year. That's fine, but we just don't want to be doing 3 things at one time. That's very tough to manage 3 different projects.
One of the thoughts that I had that we haven't talked about too is, and I don't know if the board has discussed it, because I haven't been able to listen to all the meetings, but the idea of using some of these borrowing mechanisms to fund the field project or the geothermal and using DSEB for that, or for life safety, or some of the other line items that we have in the 5-year projections that are bringing fund balance down currently. That's an option that I think is viable. But I'm interested in hearing other committee members' thoughts on borrowing for non-project 2 capital. And his thoughts. All right.
Steve,
Yeah.
I'll jump in on that one. Just a couple, 2 things. One, I'm coming back to your comment about debt philosophy, and I had one comment I wanted to make, and the second is the track and field. So this, because from my perspective, they're all projects, and singling one out for debt versus another one out for debt more, in my opinion, has to do with where we are in our fund balance policy. When we had earlier, we brought to this committee earlier discussion this whole debt policy question and borrowing, but at the time, we were above where we needed to be, so it kind of didn't make much sense, right? To consider those projects just because they were earlier on. I don't know if that makes sense or not. Am I making sense?
I'm not sure I followed you.
Okay, the question was, should we look at debt for the track and field project? And really, we have that project, we have project 2, it's all work that we need to do. And I agree with the way you're leading things, which is we need to look holistically at all the capital needs of the district, and then say what's the right way to finance the whole picture. My point was that when we first we had earlier discussions just to tee up the debt policy, we were not really in a position to borrow because we still were well north of our fund balance target, etc. That's what I'm trying to say. Maybe
75%.
we were over 100%. And so talking about borrowing, even if it for track and field, when you're over 100%, we were still dealing with the fund balance hangover, okay? My second, is that clearer or?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry, the second comment, you're just talking about the debt, discussion on debt, and we haven't talked about it much. There was some input that the board gave this committee that I just want to restate, which is we do have a capital campaign that is, moving forward with the intent of trying to raise resources to help support the district. And so as that materializes, as we get different options to consider, we will then probably want to say, as a board, we look at that and say, well, what happens if we get in a bunch of money? And, that will kind of be a modification even to the options we look at. So
you're just a couple bullet points ahead of me on my outline.
I'm sorry.
Oh, okay. Okay, so I kind of threw out the borrowing for non-project 2 stuff and nobody else had comments, which is fine. So the next piece that I want to talk about is more specifically project 2 funding. Starting out with, are there any funding methods that we think should be off the table for project 2? I sort of weighed in on my thoughts on debt certificates. I guess my purpose would be to not utilize debt certificates, but I want to give everybody else a chance to.
I think we have more options than debt certificates, so I think we should just take that one off the table.
Yes, I agree as well.
Anyone else with opinion either way?
I agree.
Then the next piece I had was to Tom's point about foundation fundraising. I see 3 potential ways that if those funds come in at a significant level that they could be used. One would be to abate debt. So if we issue debt to pay for the project, then you abate the levy. That basically means, and that the district was doing that with the fund balance in years past before it went debt free. Instead of levying it, they paid the debt out of the balances they had and they reduced or abated the levy for debt. We could also reduce the operating tax levy to offset that by any funds that are raised. And then I think the third option would be to reduce the amount of borrowing. So as you said, Callie, this is a multi-year process with different funding, pieces along the way. If we get funds from the foundation at a point earlier in the project, then we just issue less debt, down the line. That helps with the debt limit. All of these benefit the taxpayers because we're reducing the tax levy to one degree or another. But I think the lessening, the borrowing saves on cost rate off. You don't pay any of the interest. It's a more direct reduction in the taxes right off the bat instead of the abatement, the reduced levy pieces.
So this is going to be specific for building and construction purposes, the foundation money.
Yes, it is for major capital projects.
Okay.
And I think it's fair to agree, and Tom should correct me if I'm misrepresenting this, but when the board discussed this exact question back in January for guidance for CFC, they talked about, they didn't say exactly how, of course, but they talked about specifically using funds through donations for the purpose of reducing the amount of debt overall. And there was a little bit more guidance I can provide from the foundation regarding what we're talking about as far as potential available capital there, but I'll hold up until we're ready for the conversation.
Anyone else with comments regarding the outside fundraising? How would we use that?
I can't. I mean, right now I just have to assume 0. I know we got that email from the National Foundation president today with potential numbers, but until I see the check cut to, OPRF, I can't. I mean, so when that check gets cut, then I can kind of weigh in on what would be the best option, because all those sound like viable potentials there. But I can't say until that check is cut, I can't say, yeah, go ahead, or, because I don't want to ask for like $50 million of debt, assuming that $10 million is going to come in, and then, oops, only 2 came in, so then we're like, well, great, we only asked for 50, but we needed 60. So I want to, like, worst case scenario, assume 0, and then, because obviously timing of that will be, you can ask for 60 and then we only issue 40 because 20 came in, then great. Kind of thing.
Does the new agreement with the foundation provide any kind of a timetable or are they in initial conversations?
Cindy, you might be able to look at a timetable a little bit better. I could talk about the suggestions they talked about for the dollar amount, so maybe you could as well. So go ahead.
So, in one of our meetings, what we've talked about is just basically that we're gonna have to line up as the payments are coming in. The payments we have to make for the project, that the donation should be aligning as best as possible with that. And then also to aligning with the borrowing. So if we're gonna take that on, that's how that would basically be lined up. Because it's not that they're just gonna cut us a check, it would actually be, we are paying something and saying that we need this, here's the invoice that we paid on.
Oh, so $170,048,380 sounds good.
I will talk, so you can do it.
In case you guys are looking at numbers, I figured one.
What they talked about is a modeling based off of based off of what commitments they have available at this point and what they anticipate down the road, modeling kind of 3 tiers of donations potentially coming in the area of 15, 20 to 25. That's the guidance that the foundation board has shared. Million, yes, yeah, not dollars. $15. We'll take $15. I want to be clear. But yes, that's right.
So I have a question on the one where you have future reduced levies. So let's say the district, I'm just using a number here, the district's going to get in, say, 2 million from the levy, but let's say we also got a donation of 2 million. Are you saying then after that year we wouldn't levy?
It's an option.
Because I'm just thinking, if you were somebody donating, would you think I'm donating to the school? So I would assume they were going to go.
But I guess that's keep in mind that we're probably going to be funding the project with that, with existing balances and talked about debt certificates that are borrowing from future tax levies. So like it's just an option that aligns with one of the ways that you could fund the project. It's just an option. I think the best option would be to have the money from the donations before you issued all of the debt, so that you end up just issuing less debt than you would have if they hadn't been able to raise the money, and then you don't pay as much interest and you don't have to get into abatement resolutions or in that example, under levying to offset money that came in. So then the last piece, as it relates to funding options as a referendum, I guess I'd like to start getting people's take on, does this need to go to a referendum or not? I don't feel like many of the scenarios really work without it. And that's my perspective. I think that the ticket is big enough that there's going to have to be a referendum piece to it. I'd like to hear everybody else's thoughts too.
Well, we are the community finance committee, so we do need to listen to the community, I feel. And I mean, it is the right thing to do. I would definitely favor a referendum process.
Thank you. Anyone else want to weigh in?
Is scenario 4 the only scenario that doesn't have a referendum piece?
Yeah, and just for your benefit, Kathleen, these there's an infinite, number of permutations of options. These were 5 that we put together just for starters. These were not considered 5 best or 5 most different options. Again, I think I'm hoping that we're working towards some preferences on the different funding components where we can come up with some recommendations that are much more fine-tuned than these. But yeah, of those 5 initial options, only scenario 4 didn't have a referendum.
Okay, and then can I ask another question?
Yeah, absolutely.
So is it always the case that with the DFED bonds, that there's a petition period so that the community could request a referendum?
Generally, yes, if they are life safety bonds, which are life safety is a niche of capital projects that are required under state law, you can do those without the petition period, but everything else is subject to that. Is that correct, Elizabeth?
So we will be going to referendum on CIP projects too, the CIP project of the project, or just the developmental, new, modern, something we're building?
That's something that we can recommend,
I mean,
recommendation on.
Well, I'm just confused by your distinction there.
You talk about project 2 versus the maintenance plan.
Project 2, that's something versus the project, part of project 2, that's just fixing something. I mean, do we really have to go to referendum for something we're just fixing? For something that we're like developing, if we want to build a new wing or something like that, and the pictures that you see, that.
Well, I know there's been some evolution on what's in and out of project 2, but the board approved a scope last week, and my understanding is essentially all new construction, like it's for the vast majority of it. Right?
Yeah, not only was it last week, but it is. That project has been.
Okay.
So, yeah, so.
It's that southeast corner of the building is
That's right.
gone and completely rebuilt.
Yeah, so the health by safety funds that you're speaking about, that would be a kind of a different extension basis. But it's not really applicable to our project, to project 2, because it's essentially new construction.
Okay.
I guess other than the west pool, did that end up in the final scope, I think, didn't it? It was an addendum in some earlier versions.
It's no, so as far as project 2 is concerned, there is the approval for infill of the west pool to be used for a different purpose. So maybe there's a small portion there. Good point.
It's more renovation than new construction, but you probably can break out the numbers in the estimates.
Yeah, no, that's a good point though. There's probably something in there that would fall.
But I think it's what you were getting at, though, Callie. If we look at the 5-year projection, the line items for building maintenance and life safety and those other things, like, in theory, those could be part of a referendum, but we feel like the district should just ask for everything under a referendum. Or we could recommend that. But again, we got a fund balance as well above our target, and so I think we should spend some of that down on some portion of some of the capital needs and then referendum the rest.
That's what I was saying.
Yeah.
I have a question. I'm a little confused. So your question is, if it's a part of project or any capital project that is not technically, what do you say, necessary?
No,
or let's say the maintenance driven, right?
Right.
That should not go to referendum.
I'm asking.
I'm trying to understand
Are we gonna split it up, or are we?
Well, that's why I'm confused about. So I'm trying to understand like where we are as a committee, because I'm really just trying to listen and get the information that you guys present. But either you're going referendum for a dollar amount or you're not, right? Because if you're going to start carving out the need versus what the community wants and so on and so forth, now you're not no longer in finance, you're more in something else, right? Because finance would be strictly the dollar amount for what it is. You're going to finance, you're not going to finance, how you can finance it. You are carving out items that you think should not go to referendum. Who decided that? Or to be strictly the dollar amount? That's what we're looking at.
Well, when you go to a referendum, you go for a dollar amount and you have this
Well, that's
scope of the project
that's my
too.
point, because we're not really talking about what the scope is, so we're taking project two out of it, right? There will be other projects we have to do going forward. Are we saying every project or everything we do should go to referendum, or it's just project two because it's so contentious in the community? Because I really don't want to get us in the habit of, well, making decisions that are not financed and data driven. Either we're dollar amount we're gonna look at or we're not. It has to be more clear for me, it's more clearly defined what future boards to kind of look at instead of the project two lens. I think we're at that, that's what we're looking at, around the project two lens as opposed to the lens for every project we do going forward. That's just my, that's.
So my 2 cents to that is that the need for a referendum in this specific case is twofold. One, the scope of the project from a construction standpoint, as well as the scope of the financial need. They're both, I think, driving the need for it to go to referendum. And similarly going forward, that's how future referendum decisions should be made also is what's the size of the project, in dollar need, and as well as, you know, I think it's kind of what you were getting at, Cal, is like, is this a repair and maintenance project, or is this a new construction project?
Right, because we're trying to build everything now to go into the future. Because you said earlier that there's years of decay and things like that. So some things are gonna have to be newly constructed, and then we go from there as the management moving forward. But some things, like I looked at the thing, it says roof or tuck pointer or something. Why would that be part of new construction unless it's just maintenance, unless you're taking down all the bricks and then it's new construction? So I'm just asking, making a point about it.
Yeah, but it's all kind of new. We're not building anything new. I mean, we're remodeling everything here. It would be cheaper to just do going to school. Honestly, it would have been. But if you look at, I mean, over the 5 years, it would be, if you look at project 1 through 5, we built a brand new school for cheaper. So everything actually is a remodel. But I'm just really trying to hone in on that when we're looking at project 2. It's the debt policy should not be driven by project 2. Project 2 should be driven by debt policy. And I think that's not happening. And I just want to make sure when we're looking at bigger picture, the debt policy will be in existence beyond project 2. Or beyond all of a sudden, let's say change it, new policy or whatever. But I just want to make sure we're looking at it in a way that's the best thing for the community and future board members, administrations, and not just a project 2 lens. Because I know that's a hot topic in the community, but I have the privilege of not having to see it through the lens and look at it as data and pragmatism. That's what I am. So if we can do that, make sure that's what we're focusing on, that will serve the future board community better.
Yeah, I don't have the whole debt policy in front of me, but that is something that I want to revisit, is because I don't recall if it speaks towards sort of defining that choice of this is a referendum project versus not, but I think that is something that this committee should be looking to also codify it in the policy. So to your point, the policy should be driving the decision.
It's always say that because I won't say sure referendum now, and there's no why for the reasoning, which is okay, but if that's the case, then that means every project you do over some dollar amount will referendum or should. It can be what we feel it is on this project, but what it should be for every project going forward. It has to be data driven, has to be pragmatic, it can't be emotional in any way, shape, or form. Because going forward, we have to have this policy for when I'm not on the board, you're on the committee or whoever it is, it has to be shaped for every person on the be on this committee.
No, no.
Yes, Steve, if I can jump in on that one quickly. You know, there's been reference to the non-binding referendum question of a year or two ago. That was, you know, I guess 77% or whatever the number was, said that any expenditure over $5 million should go to referendum. So that was what's been talked about. You know, the question really is, you know, if the committee believes that we should, you know, do, if that's part of policy, there should be some kind of a standards. Just as a point of reference, we've done that right there would eclipse almost a number of our annual maintenance work. And that would include, that would have, it meant the track and fields, et cetera. So, as we talk about it, we got to get specific.
Yeah, that's something I would like to bring to our next meeting for the conversation is we have a tentative meeting between the cow and the board meeting in March.
I think the 14th, is that?
That might be
Third.
the first thing, right, then,
Monday. It's Monday.
If it's a Friday, well.
But yeah, I think we should explore further how we would codify that decision process of identifying this is a project versus the maintenance, and do we want to set a dollar threshold? Go with that. Thank you, Kabir, for your thoughts on that. Anybody else with thoughts related to referendum? Is that a good next step to kind of look at it through a policy lens of maybe trying to make a decision tree of some sort for future boards and how to evaluate that?
I think that's a good idea.
We kind of started off that track last year, right? Kind of looking at that debt policy and thinking what we needed to do, but we didn't really get far.
I'll send out the recommendation that we sort of passed on to the administration after that October meeting, so that everybody can look at it. But I don't recall it speaking related to the referendum decision making process at all.
I think it was just kind of mentioned. I mentioned that at one point. It was like, should we have that debt policy conversation? Like lay out like a process or decision tree, as you said. So they could figure it out, so that agreed. So he said, so from the point to him, like, okay, they want us to look at this, this, and this, and on future decisions of spending.
It's accountability too. Those are right accountable, that's coming out of the government, so. Well.
I think then all the other pieces that we talked about related to D7 and debt certificate and everything else will sort of feed into that also then and really. Yeah, reduce the number of options and make it clear for the board. So I guess. Yeah, go ahead, Tom.
Can I just jump in there because you reduce it? So to me, I'm gonna jump in as the recipient of what the work of this committee will be, and we provided a bunch of kind of parameters or expectations, but as the committee goes forward and continues to say, okay, here are the different options, and what would be helpful is to frame it up in kind of answering these questions. One, as we look at the different options and including what the committee says we don't want to do, and what we feel shouldn't be done versus what should be done. What's the impact on our taxpayers? Because there's been a lot of up and down of, yeah, this one really cost the taxpayers this much money or not. So that's an important thing as a board member to have the support of the committee assessing that. Two, what's the impact on the district's long-term ability to finance its capital? And I think this discussion tonight has been very much centered on that, which is great. That we're not looking at this as a project two, but as we decide and make decisions, we want to make sure that we're thinking, step 2, 3, we're keeping future boards and future community members in mind. And 3, what is the impact on the operating or the ability of the district to run? So I just throw those out there as you're talking about what the different options you're going to throw, come back to us with.
Thanks, Tom. So I think to try to summarize next steps with the goal of being to look at scenarios through the lenses that Tom just laid out. To Kareem's point, we need some more data in a few different places. One, regarding non-referendum borrowing for our peer districts, what's their, do they have any policies related to that, and what's their practice for utilizing that borrowing option? I think I'll be able to find data to that point, maybe death certificates too, but that might be a little harder. I also want, I know I can easily pull data, peer data regarding debt limits and to what extent our peer districts are utilizing their debt. They're utilizing debt and how much available debt limit they have. And then. Yeah, I guess those are the two big data points, and then revisiting a recommended debt policy to see if it speaks to referendums or not. I don't think it does, and coming up with a plan for how we might want to address referendums in that policy. Those sound like good next steps that I just volunteered to do most of the work on.
Question, since we had the meeting, we're doing like a subcommittee meeting, or I think it's a lot of to do now and then. I'm not part of it, of course, I'm just curious.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about it. We didn't really do a working group. I had some personal stuff going on with family over the last month that didn't allow me to pull us all together to the extent I hope to. I mean, I think this is all data that I could report back if we meet on the 13th. It's giving 2 weeks to pull it together. You know, we'd also talked about potentially having something that we would take to the board of the Cal. That was the 9th, whatever, but I don't know if there's time where we feel like we've got enough substantive stuff to bring to that for a conversation there or not at this point.
Would it be what you brought tonight?
It would be a recap of the conversation tonight.
Well, I don't think we got anywhere tonight.
Right.
Bring information on to the account. Well, not to get anywhere, but there's nothing to present.
Yeah, I don't feel like there's a.
Yeah, not, yeah. Tom, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is there's more work to be done. I mean, in terms of getting a recommend, you know, at least saying here are some recommendations, you know, some options for that look at the different scenarios. It sounds like there's more work to be done.
Anyone else have any other thoughts on project 2 agenda item?
I think we just need to make a point that the board wants more scenarios than what she gave us. That's why we're doing this, right?
Not more, just of what.
Or options.
Well, not more than this market making decisions, so with more of what's the best one or two, whatever it is option that you recommend based on a couple factors, tax burden, lowest cost community, so on and so forth. So
Right.
more options in the market making decisions.
So not just what she did.
Well, it would be, I don't know. So it has to be what makes the most sense fiscally for the board. And I mean, that's what my ask is first.
Yeah, and I heard your other ask being, we need more data to back up any recommendations to changes to policy that would affect the choices that are available.
Can be, I think it should be.
Okay.
I don't know what that means. So I think we need reasons why we make decisions.
And that's just my look, can you define for me like low cost? Only because like, so like say you stay our $100, I will borrow $100 and pay back over 20 years. It's gonna be.
I'll say lowest, so the lowest best option is what I mean, so I'm not gonna say percentage, but if you have one that is you have a 19% repayment as opposed to like a 15 or whatever it is, but the years matter as far as the rate you're paying, right? And that is a function, so looking at through that, what is the lowest cost, not just interest rate of the repayment period. It has been a holistic approach, that way, when we make a decision at the board, we know we do what's best in the interest of the community, and I can see it well, and that's what I'm asking for.
Okay.
Steve, just you know, I kind of said in terms of as they're evaluated, and I mentioned the three things, but the one that I didn't mention, but really has been a center of this, which is, as we look at it, it also is how do things, how do the different options fit within our policy, which is kind of probably the obvious, and and how does that policy fit within peers, which is what this discussion is about. So I think that's been a good part of this discussion.
Which policy are you specifically speaking to?
In this case, it would be our fund balance policy,
balance.
our debt policy,
Okay,
right?
yeah, so we talked about trying to do some debt comparisons, but we could probably just as easily, if I'm digging into policies everywhere else, you look at fund balance policies too.
Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, I'll work into it. Answer that question.
Sorry,
How it's working, well, even if you lose data, I don't know if you can ask or see how it's working, what's pros and cons of what their policy is, and just because they're doing something, you should do it also. I think that's something that's working, makes sense. Then looking at our community a little different, there's different variables, but I think we look at it from that lens, we're careful to make a decision, that's the kind of central part of it. And where we're looking at a comparative history, is it working for them, or will they tweak anything? But I know that's a lot of data I'm asking for, Steve, so you can't, I understand, but that's just me thinking out loud as we're doing our wish list.
I may be looking for some volunteers to help with the data gathering, just be forewarned.
Gibson's here we come.
All right. Okay, I think this has been some really good conversation. We didn't get as far through the process as I would have liked, but I knew it was going to be a lot of stuff to digest, and I appreciate the board's desire for everything to be at a high level and to be data driven and not just my feeling. If I was in cities to a great spot, I can share my feelings and as an employee and say, this is what I think we should do. But in this role, we're advisory and it should be a collaborative process that's data driven. And so I appreciate that a lot. So I look forward to doing some digging and bringing some more information back for our next conversation. Last call for comments on this topic. So future agenda items, I think, is generally going to be what we just recapped and all the information that we'll share back. Does that March 3rd, leave the 10 out of
March 13th.
say the date on that a week or two ago? So I want to make sure that works for people and let her know if it doesn't, and we'll keep an eye on the quorum counts. But let's plan on meeting then. All right. I need a motion to adjourn this. I just forget it. Just adjourn.
Need a motion in a
Okay.
second. And then
Okay.
Motion.
Second.